Hello and welcome. I'm Marit Bagstad, Trade Sales Director for the Americas at Springer Nature, and I'm so grateful that OverDrive offered to host this event and help us spread the word about our recently published sci-fi collection, Just Like Being There. If you know anything about Springer Nature, you may be surprised that I mentioned sci-fi, and I'll certainly touch on this as we move through our program. Before we jump into today's conversation, I'm going to very briefly introduce Springer Nature. Our company is committed to the idea that science and learning truly matter. Springer Nature was created in 2015 through the combination of Nature Publishing Group, Macmillan Education, and Springer Science and Business Media. But while we are newer in company name, our brands carry 180 years of prestige in academic publishing. Our books portfolio sits within our research division, where our mission is to advance discovery by publishing robust and insightful research, supporting the development of new areas of knowledge and making the ideas and information accessible around the world. Complementing the umbrella of Springer Nature's publishing brand, our keybook imprints maintain a strong and unique market identity that is sought after by academics and professionals around the world. These include Springer with a strong focus on STEM subjects, Copernicus, where our popular science titles targeted to a general audience often sit, Palgrave Macmillan that gets to the heart of what matters across the humanities and social sciences, and A-Press, which is relied on by IT professionals and developers of all levels. Our goal is to connect our books to three distinct audiences: professionals and researchers immersed in their respective fields and careers, students advancing their own research and coursework, and general readers seeking unbiased information about the world around them. Among our books for curious minds and general readers sits our small but mighty science fiction program. However fictional, Springer Sci-Fi includes real science written by scientists. In fact, in the book, which is the focal point of today's discussion, Just Like Being There, you'll find an afterword offering scientific insight into each story. So without further ado, today I'm very excited to introduce our author, Eric Choi, who is an aerospace engineer, editor, and science fiction writer. His short stories bring science and engineering concepts to life through page-turning narratives. Eric's writing is informed by his robust engineering career, where he has worked on many space projects, including quantum encryption and science satellite, and the meteorological payload on the Phoenix Mars lander. In the course of his literary career, Eric has twice won the Aurora Award for authoring the short story Crimson Sky and for co-authoring The Dragon and the Stars with Derwin Mark. Additionally, Eric was the first recipient of the Azimuth Award for his novelette Dedication, and there is much more to know about Eric, all shared on his website, aerospacewriter.ca. We are very lucky that OverDrive's resident sci-fi enthusiast and game buff, and not to mention digital content librarian, Kenny Cruse, has read Just Like Being There to very favorable review and agreed to act as the facilitator for today's conversation. And I'll now hand the program over to Eric and Kenny.
Thanks, Merritt. Eric, it's lovely to meet you. I gotta tell you, I absolutely loved your book. I think my favorite story in here was From a Stone. I love any story that has anything to do with first contact, and then that kind of like tie back into archaeology was really interesting. So I have a couple of questions for you, and we'll just kind of go down the list here. I often find that scientists are inspired to pursue careers in science by works of science fiction that kind of influenced their childhood. Was this true for you?
First of all, Kenny, it's an absolute pleasure to be here today and to talk to you about certainly one of my favorite topics, and yours, it seems, science fiction. So in the case of science fiction influencing or inspiring my career in engineering the sciences, the answer is absolutely yes. I would say that one of my earliest recollections was this sort of grainy television image of this poor person in a red shirt who was about to be consumed or killed by this acid secreting creature. And I learned later on, after several years, that this was actually an episode of the original classic Star Trek called The Devil in the Dark. So it was, in many ways, that particular television show, both the original Star Trek, which I watched as a child in reruns, and a lot of the subsequent series up till today that very much inspired and informed and continues to inspire and inform both my own desire to be a science fiction writer and my my aerospace career.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was raised on Star Trek myself. I was in the Next Generation era, though. So it looks like you spent much of your academic career juggling between creative writing and scholarly writing. So I went through and saw a couple of your more scholarly works, and in addition to a lot of the creative writing that you've done over the years. How does the writing process for scholarly content compare to the writing process for this short form fiction? And which one well, this is kind of an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But which one do you prefer?
Well, I would say that there are a lot of similarities between the two. A short fiction story, a science fiction story, has a narrative arc. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But if you think about it, a scholarly paper really has an arc as well. It's got an introduction. It's got a description of the research methodology. It'll present the data, and then it sort of wraps it all together in a discussion of the results and a conclusion. So I guess one way of thinking about it is both a fictional story and a scholarly paper, in their own ways, they're both telling a story and trying to do so in a way that is most compelling and convincing to their respective audiences. Now, to your unfair quotation marks, air quotation marks, unfair question as to whether I have a preference, obviously both of them have their place, but maybe I'll say that I have a little bit more latitude in terms of making things up in a fictional story, obviously, than of the scholarly variety. So perhaps I'll leave it at that.
Sure. Yeah, that's absolutely. All right. Just like being there, feature stories centering around an array of sciences. What does researching for hard science fiction like this, like a story like this, look like? Does it look very similar to doing research for an academic work?
I suppose there would be some similarities in that it's a very iterative process. So many of my story ideas originally come from the scientific literature, either from a paper or a letter or something in the scientific news media. And from there, and perhaps befitting of my engineering background, I do tend to plan out and plot things out in a fair bit of detail before I even get to a first draft. So I don't have an example to show right now, but if I did, basically you would see things like lots of sticky notes that I tend to move around and scrawl and scratch things in and out of. And in the process of coming up with that plot plan, that in many ways is a motivation or trigger into what other sorts of research I need to do to fill in the gaps of the story or to meet the requirements of the narrative. But even here in this case, it tends to be iterative because I've had instances where it was actually the process of the research itself that got me out of writer's block, or even gave me an idea for how to conclude a story. And I can give an example of that, as if I may.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Plug another book other than a Springer book. I'm sorry about this, but there's another collection that just came out called Brave New Worlds. And I've got a story here called A New Brave World. And it's about an exoplanet, or it's rather set on an extrasolar planet that is tidally locked to its parent star. And there were certain characteristics of this orbital configuration that influenced the environment on such a planet. And finding this out, learning about this over the course of my research, actually gave me the idea of how to end this story.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, that's awesome. Actually, pretty good segue into another part of this question. Was there anything that you discovered during research for one of these stories that really surprised you, or maybe even helped you in your engineering career?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess if I could maybe pull it back and talk a little bit more generically, one of the values or the things that I greatly enjoy in the process of research for stories is, and you know, sort of getting ahead of ourselves perhaps, but it's to sort of stimulate or motivate that sense of curiosity as to, well, you know, something is like ABC, what if it was something like XYZ instead? And I think that sense of curiosity, of peeking under the rocks and looking a little bit beyond, has served me well in my engineering career as well.
Great, great, great. So one of the things that I love about your stories is that these scientist protagonists seem to exhibit this kind of what I consider a uniquely human trait of slightly reckless but educated curiosity. Do you agree? Do you agree that they have that?
That is a very, very interesting way of putting it. So I would certainly agree that, speaking as an engineer, I would say that engineers definitely exhibit that trait of educated curiosity. But if you might forgive me, Kenny, I'll perhaps take a little bit of exception, disagree a little bit with the characteristic or the trait of recklessness. And in fact,
Sure. Yeah.
I would say that engineers are really very careful people, and indeed, they make great efforts to identify and mitigate risks. And maybe one of the examples I'll cite of that is the Apollo 13 incident.
Oh, yeah,
So,
sure.
way back in April of 1970, the Apollo 13 mission, when it's on its way to the moon, there was an explosion in the oxygen tank, one of the oxygen tanks in the service module, which crippled the spacecraft and put the lives of the astronauts in jeopardy. And this is a story that, of course, has been well documented in movies and books and documentaries and so forth. But what was really impressive to me, if you look at the engineers in mission control, who in many cases had nothing but hours, and in some cases literally minutes, to make urgent life and death decisions, they still made the time to do the careful engineering analysis as best they can and with as much real world data as they can. And they did this not because they had the luxury of time, but exactly that they did not have the luxury of time. So I would say that I would agree entirely, but that engineers are indeed a curious lot. But I would perhaps take exception that they're necessarily reckless people.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. No, I when I was coming up with that question, I was remembering that one section of From a Stone where the scientists were like, "Oh yeah, we found this interesting pit. We're gonna go down in there," and everybody was telling them no, and I'm like, "Yeah, but come on, first contact." All right. So the scientist protagonists of your stories are often waylaid by external roadblocks, be it the government intervention, Byzantine bureaucracy, or sticks in the mud, which are only cleared by the passion of these scientists. Is there a time in your engineering career or education where this happened to you, and how did you navigate that situation while staying true to your passion for science?
Well, that's a great question, and I think it follows on very nicely to the one you just asked and the discussion you just had. You're probably thinking again about From a Stone, which I'm I'm really pleased that that you like that story, that you recalled that I had portrayed a little bit of a tension perhaps between this fictional astronaut crew and the authorities back on Earth. So in my own engineering career, in the early part of my engineering career, I had the privilege to work on the robotic systems aboard the International Space Station. And because this was a government human spaceflight program, very similar in ways to the fictional mission I portrayed in From a Stone, and because there were lives at stake, there was the lives and the safety of the astronauts and the cosmonauts are on the line. There was a lot of management and oversight and processes and procedures in place above and beyond the actual engineering or any sort of scientific research that was being done on the station. And maybe as a bit of a way of a contrast is that today in my current day job, I'm working with a small and medium enterprise that is using these, you've probably seen them, these small and inexpensive microsatellite class, these things about the size of a microwave oven. And these satellites that my employer has in space, they measure greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And as you can imagine, the sort of oversight and the processes for these types of uncrewed commercial satellite missions is much more streamlined than in the case of these big government human spaceflight programs where there are astronauts and human lives online. So really, there's a reason and a place, I think, for both of these approaches.
Excellent. That's interesting. Yeah. So in your title story, Just Like Being There, you touch on the pros and cons of human versus robotic or virtual space exploration, and specifically talking about the spontaneity of discovery, including the ability to accurately analyze that discovery as being the main differences between those two. What do you think? This is kind of a more broad science question, but what do you think the future holds for human space exploration on the moon, Mars, and beyond?
Well, I think the future is very exciting. As many of us know, there are activities underway right now related to the anticipated return of humans to the moon, with the anticipated launch of the NASA Space Launch System rocket and the Orion spacecraft on the Artemis 1 mission. And in terms of beyond the moon, space agencies around the world are continuing to explore Mars with robotic missions, including fairly detailed planning now underway for an international robotic sample return mission. And with the expectation that all of these robotic missions to Mars will serve as preparatory activities or precursors to eventual human missions to Mars. What I think is important in the future human exploration of going back to the moon and going on to Mars and maybe beyond Mars is that it really has to be done in a sustainable manner. So if we go back to the Apollo moon landings of the late 1960s and early 1970s, that was a spectacular accomplishment, but ultimately it was done in a way that really was not sustainable. So you had, for example, this massive, unbelievably complex Saturn V rocket. This thing was like a 36-story building. And at the end of all that, the only thing that ever came back to Earth was that little capsule at the top that was about the size of a compact car or something. And even that was never used again. That was shipped off to a museum right away. And this type of architectures, as they call it in the lingo of the type of missions that they were doing, were successful in the way of achieving the goal, but was very expensive and ultimately not sustainable, which is why the Apollo mission stopped. So as we go ahead back to the moon and Mars and beyond, I do hope that we will heed those lessons of Apollo and do these future exploration activities in a sustainable manner.
Great. Yeah. Wonderful. So you mentioned in your preface for Just Like Being There that a story called The Road Not Taken by Eric G. Iverson, which turns out to be a pseudonym for the prolific alt history writer Harry Turtledove, is one of your main inspirations for science fiction. You also mentioned a really great painting, Visit to Utopia by Pat Rawlings, as one of your inspirations for dedication. What would you say to those that might be inspired by your stories in the same way that you were inspired?
Well, I have to say that quotation marks Eric G. Iverson, Harry Turtledove story had a tremendous impact on me. And in fact, it means so much to me that, all these decades later, I kept that issue of Analog magazine as a bit of a reminder. It really is every writer's hope that their stories are to be read, of course. And if we're so fortunate that maybe people will actually enjoy our stories, which I hope you did, Kenny. And
absolutely.
If and beyond that, if not just to enjoy, but if there are people who actually find inspiration, for example, in my stories, well, that's just really humbling, and it's something that would make me happy beyond words. And then maybe taking that one step further is in reading my stories, if there are people out there that are inspired or motivated to maybe become writers themselves, or to perhaps pursue a career in engineering science, or maybe do all of the above, as somehow I've managed to done, then I would certainly take some humble but happy satisfaction in the knowledge that that maybe my writing has made some kind of positive impact.
Well, I think that you are on a good path because, man, these stories in this book are great. I absolutely loved the insight that you provided in each one of the afterwords for each one of the stories.
Thank you.
And again, thank you for this book. It's wonderful. I absolutely loved it. And that's all the questions that I have today. So, Merritt, you want to go ahead and take it away?
Absolutely. Thank you. So many thanks to both Eric and Kenny for such an engaging conversation. I so enjoyed it. I hope that we have inspired you to look for Just Like Being There on OverDrive, and also to explore other offerings in our science and fiction series. This collection of books is curated with science buffs, scientists, and science fiction fans in mind, exploiting the borderlands between accepted science and its fictional counterpart. And really special thanks to OverDrive for helping us highlight this fun and niche corner of our catalog. And we always welcome questions and feedback about this or any other titles from the Springer Nature portfolio. And that concludes our presentation.